The morning light filtered through the grand windows of the Whitmore estate as Marcus Chun moved silently through the dining room, setting each piece of fine china with practiced precision. His movements were economical, respectful, nearly invisible. 7 years of working as a butler had taught him the art of being present yet unseen. At the mahogany table, 7-year-old Timothy Whitmore sat motionless, staring at his untouched breakfast. The boy's fingers traced intricate patterns along the edge of his plate, a behavior Marcus had observed for months. Not random fidgeting, but something more deliberate. The child's eyes tracked the morning shadows with an intensity that spoke of deep thought. Mrs. Victoria Whitmore swept into the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She barely glanced at her son before turning to Marcus with practiced authority. "Timothy, eat your breakfast," she commanded, though the boy showed no acknowledgement of her words. Marcus continued his quiet work, but his trained eye caught something others missed. Timothy's finger patterns weren't meaningless. They followed the rhythm of the grandfather clock in the hallway, precise and mathematical. The boy was listening, processing, communicating in his own language that no one else seemed to understand. "Where in the world are you watching from today?" Marcus thought to himself, wondering about his own daughter Emma, probably getting ready for school right now in their small apartment across town. Dr. Harrison Whitmore entered the dining room with the weary expression of a man who had tried everything. The renowned surgeon kissed his wife's cheek before approaching his son's chair. "Timothy, good morning," he said gently, but received no response. Marcus watched from the corner as Dr. Whitmore knelt beside Timothy's chair. The boy's fingers continued their rhythmic tracing, now moving in groups of 3, then 5, then 7. Prime numbers, Marcus realized with a start. The child was creating mathematical sequences. "We have another appointment with Dr. Reynolds this afternoon," Mrs. Whitmore announced to her husband. "The specialist thinks intensive behavioral therapy might help." She spoke as if Timothy weren't there, her frustration evident in every word. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He had seen this pattern before, in his previous life. The well-meaning parents, the parade of specialists, the child growing more withdrawn with each failed intervention. Timothy wasn't broken. He was brilliant, communicating in ways that required patience and understanding to decode. As Dr. Whitmore left for the hospital and Mrs. Whitmore retreated to her study, Marcus began clearing the table. Timothy's plate remained untouched, but the boy had arranged his silverware in perfect geometric patterns. Each fork tine aligned with mathematical precision, creating angles that spoke of a mind far more complex than anyone realized. Have you ever felt like you had something important to say, but no one was listening? Marcus wondered, thinking of all the children he once helped find their voices. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library as Marcus dusted the leather-bound volumes. Timothy sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, surrounded by wooden blocks arranged in complex patterns. The child's concentration was absolute, his small hands moving each piece with deliberate intent. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, doctor, we'll try the new medication if you think it will help," she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. She ended the call and stared at her son with a mixture of love and desperation. Marcus continued his work, but his peripheral vision tracked Timothy's movements. The boy wasn't playing randomly. He was building structures that followed architectural principles, creating bridges and towers that demonstrated an intuitive understanding of physics and engineering. "Timothy, come along," Mrs. Whitmore called. "Time for your appointment." The child didn't respond, but Marcus noticed his shoulders tense slightly. Timothy understood more than anyone realized. As Mrs. Whitmore approached to collect her son, Timothy suddenly swept his arm across the blocks, scattering them violently. The crash echoed through the room. Mrs. Whitmore sighed deeply. "He does this every time we mention the doctor," she said to no one in particular. Marcus watched as Timothy retreated to the corner, rocking gently. The child wasn't being difficult. He was overwhelmed, communicating the only way he knew how. In his previous career, Marcus had worked with dozens of children like Timothy. He understood the fear behind the behavior, the brilliant mind trapped by communication barriers that everyone mistook for defiance. That evening, Marcus returned to his modest apartment where 80-year-old Emma waited at their small kitchen table, homework spread before her. "Daddy," she said, looking up with bright eyes, "Mrs. Patterson says I'm the best reader in my class." Marcus smiled, hanging his butler's jacket on the back of a chair. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." He ruffled her dark hair, so different from the formal interactions he maintained at the Whitmore estate. Emma studied his face with the perceptive nature of a child who had learned to read her father's moods. "You look sad today," she observed. "Is it because of the little boy you told me about?" Marcus sat beside her, remembering when he used to help children like Timothy every day. Before the lawsuit, before everything changed. "Timothy is very smart, Emma. He just speaks differently than most people. Like how you used to help kids before," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Before the mean lady said you hurt someone, but you didn't really." Marcus's throat tightened. The malpractice suit had destroyed his career, his reputation, his ability to practice speech therapy. Even though he was eventually cleared, the damage was done. No clinic would hire him. Insurance companies wouldn't cover him. A single false accusation had stolen his life's work. "Will you help him anyway?" Emma asked, her innocent question cutting straight to his heart. "Even if you're just the butler now?" Marcus pulled her close, knowing that helping Timothy might risk the only job he had left. The next morning, Marcus found Timothy in the garden, arranging fallen leaves in spiraling patterns. The boy's movements were methodical, creating fractals that would have impressed a mathematician. Marcus approached slowly, keeping his distance but observing intently. Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried from the house as she spoke on the phone. "Another specialist, doctor, because nothing else has worked." Her frustration was palpable even from across the lawn. Marcus knelt several feet away and began gathering leaves himself, mimicking Timothy's spiral pattern but creating his own design. The boy glanced over, his dark eyes showing the first spark of interest Marcus had ever witnessed. Without speaking, Timothy adjusted one of his leaves, creating a bridge between his pattern and Marcus's. It was communication, pure and simple. Connection across the silence that others mistook for emptiness. Mrs. Whitmore appeared on the terrace, her expression sharp. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she called out. "Timothy needs to come inside for his morning routine." Marcus began, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Please don't encourage his odd behaviors," she said tersely. "The doctors say we need to redirect these compulsions, not indulge them." Marcus watched as Timothy's shoulders sagged, the light in his eyes dimming. "What part of this moment resonates with you?" Marcus thought to himself, remembering how many times he had seen brilliant children dimmed by well-meaning but misguided interventions that treated their unique gifts as problems to be fixed. Dr. Whitmore found Marcus polishing silver in the kitchen that afternoon. The surgeon's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of exhaustion. "We've tried 17 different specialists," he said quietly, not really speaking to Marcus but needing to voice his frustration. Marcus continued his work, listening as Dr. Whitmore poured himself coffee with shaking hands. "My son is brilliant," the doctor continued. "I see it in his eyes, in the way he processes information. But every expert tells us he's autistic, nonverbal, possibly intellectually disabled." The words hung heavy in the air. Marcus had heard them countless times before in his previous life. Labels that became prisons, diagnoses that limited rather than liberated. "Sometimes I wonder if we're missing something," Dr. Whitmore admitted, staring out the window where Timothy sat alone in the garden. "Like he's trying to tell us something, and we just don't speak his language." Marcus's hands stilled on the silver serving tray. The opening was there, the chance to share what he knew. But revealing his expertise meant risking everything. His job, his stability, Emma's security. The silence stretched between them until Dr. Whitmore sighed and left the kitchen. Marcus watched through the window as Timothy continued his leaf arrangements, creating mathematical poetry that no one else could read. The boy glanced toward the house, and for a moment, their eyes met through the glass. In that brief connection, Marcus saw a plea for understanding that broke his heart. The dinner party was Mrs. Whitmore's attempt at normalcy. 12 distinguished guests seated around the mahogany table, discussing hospital board matters. Timothy had been brought down to say goodnight, dressed in his formal clothes, standing silently beside his mother's chair. Marcus served the main course with practiced efficiency, noting how Timothy's hands fluttered anxiously at his sides. The child's breathing was becoming rapid, shallow, warning signs that Marcus recognized immediately. Dr. Reynolds, the behavioral specialist, leaned forward with patronizing interest. "And how is our young patient progressing?" he asked Mrs. Whitmore, speaking about Timothy as if he weren't there. "We're trying a new approach," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her hand resting on Timothy's shoulder. The pressure seemed to increase the boy's distress. Marcus watched as Timothy's stymieing behaviors intensified. The child began rocking slightly, his eyes darting toward the exits. Overload was approaching fast. Perhaps Timothy could demonstrate his progress, Dr. Reynolds suggested with clinical detachment. "Can you say hello to our guests, young man?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Timothy. The boy's face went pale, his breathing becoming increasingly erratic. Marcus recognized the signs of an impending meltdown, but his place as butler kept him frozen in the corner. Timothy's rocking intensified, and suddenly he let out a piercing cry that shattered the dinner party's facade. Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed crimson as her son collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by sensory overload and social pressure. "Share your thoughts about moments when you felt overwhelmed by expectations," Marcus thought desperately, knowing he had to act. Chaos erupted around the dining table as Timothy writhed on the floor, his cries echoing off the crystal chandelier. The distinguished guests recoiled in shock while Mrs. Whitmore knelt helplessly beside her son, her face burning with humiliation. "Marcus, remove Timothy immediately," she commanded through gritted teeth, her voice sharp with embarrassment and desperation. Marcus stepped forward, but instead of simply lifting the child, he knelt down and began humming softly, a low, rhythmic melody that cut through Timothy's distress. The boy's cries began to soften, his rigid body slowly relaxing as Marcus maintained eye contact and continued the gentle tune. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Whitmore hissed, acutely aware of 12 pairs of judgmental eyes watching her family's private struggle become public spectacle. Marcus ignored her, focused entirely on Timothy. He began tapping a simple pattern on the floor beside the boy, matching the rhythm of his humming. Timothy's breathing started to regulate, his frantic movements slowing as he focused on the predictable sounds and patterns. "This is highly inappropriate," Dr. Reynolds interjected, rising from his chair. "The child needs professional intervention, not amateur theatrics from the staff." Mrs. Whitmore's mortification deepened as she realized her butler was making decisions about her son's care in front of the city's medical elite. "Marcus, I said remove him now," she repeated, her authority hanging by a thread. But Timothy had stopped crying completely, his dark eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression of grateful recognition that no one else had ever achieved. The dinner party dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs as guests made hasty excuses and departed. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the empty dining room, her carefully orchestrated evening in ruins. Timothy sat peacefully in the corner with Marcus, building a small tower from dinner rolls while humming the same melody that had calmed him. "Victoria," Dr. Whitmore approached his wife cautiously. "What just happened here was remarkable. Marcus somehow reached Timothy in a way none of our specialists have managed." Mrs. Whitmore's face hardened. "What happened was our butler overstepped his bounds and humiliated us in front of colleagues," she snapped. "He's to help Harrison, not a therapist." Dr. Reynolds gathered his coat, his professional pride wounded. "I strongly advise against encouraging the staff to interfere with Timothy's treatment," he said coldly. "This kind of enabling behavior will only reinforce his inappropriate responses." Marcus felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same dismissive attitude that had destroyed his career years ago. He stood slowly, knowing his intervention had crossed an unforgivable line in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," turned on him with crystalline fury. "Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately," she declared. "Pack your things and leave tonight. I will not have my son's condition turned into some kind of experiment by unqualified staff." Timothy looked up from his rolls, his eyes wide with confusion as he sensed the tension. Marcus's heart broke as he realized he was about to lose the chance to help this extraordinary child find his voice. Marcus packed his few belongings in silence, each item a reminder of his precarious position in a world that judged him by his circumstances rather than his capabilities. Through the window, he could see Timothy in the garden, frantically searching for something among the scattered leaves. Dr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, his face conflicted. "Marcus, what you did tonight, how did you know exactly what Timothy needed?" Marcus paused, his hand on his suitcase handle. 7 years of careful invisibility warred with the desperate need to help this family understand their son. "I used to work with children like Timothy," he said quietly. Before what?" Dr. Whitmore pressed. "Before a parent accused me of inappropriate contact with their child during therapy," Marcus replied, the words still bitter after all these years. "The charges were eventually dropped, but my license was suspended. No clinic would hire me. Insurance wouldn't cover me." Outside, Timothy's distress was escalating. The boy had begun the same rocking behavior from the dinner party, his small hands pressed against his ears as he searched desperately for the leaf patterns Marcus had helped him create. Dr. Whitmore watched his son through the window. "You were a speech therapist," he said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Pediatric developmental specialist," Marcus corrected. "Timothy isn't broken, doctor. He's brilliant. He communicates through patterns, mathematics, rhythm. If this story has touched your heart, please know that every child deserves to be understood in their own language." Timothy's distress reached a breaking point as he collapsed in the garden, his small body shaking with sobs that had no words. Dr. Whitmore rushed outside, followed by Mrs. Whitmore, who stopped short when she saw her son's anguish. Marcus dropped his suitcase and ran to Timothy's side. The boy immediately reached for him, clinging desperately to the one person who had truly seen him. Marcus knelt in the scattered leaves, holding Timothy while humming the calming melody. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Whitmore demanded, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. She was watching her son respond to comfort in ways he never had before. Marcus looked directly at Timothy and began tapping a complex rhythm on the ground. 1 it with 3, pause, 1 it 2 3 4 5, pause. The Fibonacci sequence. Timothy's eyes widened with recognition and excitement. Then the miracle happened. Timothy placed his small hand over Marcus's and whispered his first word. "Numbers," he said clearly, his voice barely audible but unmistakably intentional. The garden fell silent except for the sound of Mrs. Whitmore's sharp intake of breath. Timothy looked up at his parents and spoke again, more confidently this time. "Numbers sing," he said, his dark eyes bright with the joy of finally being understood. Dr. Whitmore knelt beside them, tears streaming down his face. "My God," he whispered, "you've given us our son's voice." Mrs. Whitmore sank to her knees, reaching for Timothy, who turned to her and said clearly, "Mama, I love numbers like music." 3 months later, Marcus sat in the renovated study that now served as Timothy's learning space. Mathematical patterns decorated the walls, and soft music played while Timothy worked with specialized communication tools. The boy looked up from his number puzzles and smiled. "Marcus, 7 times 8 makes music," he said, his vocabulary growing daily. Dr. Whitmore entered carrying legal documents. "Marcus, I've spoken with the state licensing board. Given Timothy's remarkable progress and my testimony about your methods, they're willing to review your case for reinstatement." Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, her demeanor completely transformed from the demanding employer she once was. "I owe you an apology, Marcus," she said quietly, "and a debt I can never repay. You saw our son when we were blind." Marcus stood as Emma bounded into the room, now a regular visitor who had become Timothy's patient tutor and friend. The two children communicated in a mixture of words, numbers, and gestures that filled the house with joy. Timothy ran to his parents and took their hands. "I want to show Mama and Papa the song that Seven makes," he announced with the confidence of a child who knew he was heard and valued. As the family gathered around Timothy's number patterns, Marcus felt the weight of years of hiding lift from his shoulders. He was no longer just the butler. He was Marcus Chun, pediatric specialist, helping brilliant children find their voices in a world ready to listen. If this touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from, and remember that every person has hidden gifts waiting to be discovered.